Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The night had the stillness of something that had just died, like the breathless hush after a door has slammed in a house that once knew laughter. The fan above their bed rotated with a tired creak, spreading hot air that did little to quench the heaviness thickening in the room. Kim lay on her side, curled like a tired leaf, her wrapper pulled halfway up her bare thighs. Beside her, Ibuka sat upright, back hunched like a question mark, the sheet bunched in his lap as though it were holding him accountable. He hadn't looked at her yet, but the words were already boiling behind his lips, waiting to spill like oil from a cracked drum. "Kim," he said at last, his voice carrying the chill of a stranger asking for a seat on a crowded bus. She stirred faintly, her eyes barely adjusting to the dark. "I'm not in love with you anymore," he said, as if reading a headline. "I want to take another wife. I want you to leave my son." The silence that followed wasn't the shocked kind. It was deeper, like a well that had been dry for years, but still echoed when you dropped a stone. And Kim blinked twice, rolled onto her back, and stared at the ceiling as though her answer might be carved into the plaster. "Okay," she said. Just that. A single word, flat as a tire but heavier than any scream. Then she turned and pulled the sheet over her shoulder, leaving Ibuka frozen like a man who had fired a gun and wasn't sure if it had hit its mark. He couldn't sleep after that. Not because of guilt. Guilt requires a conscience to prick you like a needle, but because her silence left a bad taste in his mouth. It was like biting into ripe fruit and finding the center dry. He sat at the edge of the bed, his feet planted on the cold tiles, staring into the dark room that had once held secrets and now held nothing. The baby coughed faintly from the next room, and for a moment, Ibuka imagined the children waking up to a new stepmother in the months to come, one who wouldn't just say, "okay," and roll over. The more he thought about it, the more Kim's calmness unsettled him. A woman who didn't cry was either a woman who had died inside or one who had sharpened her silence into a sword. Around 3:40 a.m., he leaned over and shook her shoulder, his fingers rough with impatience. "Are you not even going to ask me why?" he said, his tone defensive like a dog barking at its own shadow. Kim opened her eyes slowly, like a curtain being drawn on a play no one wanted to watch. "No need," she said. "You've decided. What else is left to ask?" Ibuka stared at her, bewildered. "I hope you're not planning anything," he said, voice lowering. "Don't think you'll take anything that belongs to me. You can go with your children. Take all three. I'm keeping the house and everything in it." The word "everything" hung between them like a thread soaked in gasoline. And Kim nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "That's fine," she said, her voice a whisper softer than the wings of a moth. "Can I get 2 months? 2 weeks is too short. Let me arrange myself well." There was a pause before Ibuka grunted and turned away. He had thrown the match, but it hadn't sparked the fire he expected. From the outside, their home on Ugly Street looked unchanged. The hibiscus still bloomed along the compound fence, red petals fluttering like gossip on the wind. Neighbors still greeted them in passing, still waved at Kim when she walked her children to the gate each morning, still called Ibuka chairman with that forced respect that came with his position on the town's housing committee. But inside the house, things had begun to move in small, invisible ways. And Kim no longer asked where he was going. She no longer asked what he wanted to eat. She no longer prayed before bed. She simply moved, spoke when spoken to, and watched with eyes that saw beyond the moment. Ibuka mistook it for defeat. He believed she had accepted her fate like bread soaking quietly in soup, soft, resigned, and ready to break. And yet every evening, when he walked into the house, he felt something had shifted. A drawer open that wasn't before. A document missing from the top shelf. a look on her face that seemed to say, "You'll wish I argued." He began to mention his plans for the second wife in passing, gauging her reaction the way you test hot water with your finger. Still, she said nothing. Just or okay or noted. The tension grew roots beneath their silence, deeper than anything they'd ever shouted about. And though he walked tall outside, inside he was shrinking, drowning in a silence that knew too much. Ibuka wasn't a stupid man, arrogant, maybe, and full of himself like a well-fed cock, but not foolish. Yet, when pride ties a man's eyes shut, he will mistake a bow for a surrender. As the days rolled into weeks, he started sleeping deeper, laughing louder, even talking on the phone in front of her like a king, with no fear of rebellion. He assumed in Kim's passivity was a kind of dullness. He didn't realize she had shifted from mourning to mapping. The calendar beside her dressing table had 2 dates circled in red. One marked the end of the first month. The second, a silent promise to herself, the last day she would ever sleep under that roof. She didn't tell a soul. Even her sister, Ify, thought she was handling the matter with saintly composure. But behind that calm face was a storm wrapped in velvet. The nights she didn't sleep, she organized. The nights she cried, she did it in the kitchen while boiling rice, so the children wouldn't ask why Mummy's face looked like the rain came inside her eyes. And still, Ibuka snored beside her, unbothered, believing he had clipped her wings with one sentence. He didn't know she was learning to fly with silence. 2 weeks began to stretch like old chewing gum, pulling long and thin across silent days filled with unspoken things. Enkim no longer lived in the same emotional house as Ibuka, though their bodies still shared walls and routine. She cooked his food, yes, but no longer stirred it with her heart. Her hands performed, but her soul sat far from the pot, watching from a distant, dry place. She still ironed his shirts, folded his trousers, and placed his wristwatch on the table near the front door. But none of it came with the warmth that once made him feel like a king in his own castle. Now everything he touched in the house felt too polished, too clean, like a hotel room prepared for a man who would not stay. The children asked why Mummy no longer danced to Sunday music while sweeping. Their youngest, Tabina, kept peeking into her eyes like he was trying to find his mother's laughter behind them. But it had packed itself in a small invisible bag weeks ago. Ibuka, ever blind in the way proud men are, believed this dullness in her movements was exhaustion from the shock of his news. He thought she was slowly coming to terms with her new rank as an ex-wife in waiting. In his mind, he clipped her voice like overgrown nails. He didn't realize he had simply awakened the part of her that knew how to disappear without slamming a door. It was during those strange, pregnant days that Ibuka started planting little bombs in conversation, watching her carefully for signs of explosion. Over breakfast, he mentioned how young girls these days were more respectful. Over dinner, he laughed too loudly at jokes she wasn't telling. He let his phone ring out loud with saved names like Candy Banku and Baby Hair. He'd place it face up on the table and pretend not to notice when the screen lit up with hearts. But Enkim never took the bait. She peeled her orange, sipped her water, and wiped the baby's mouth as if he were merely another guest in the home. It irritated him in a way he didn't understand. It wasn't that he wanted her to fight, scream, or even beg. No, he wanted her to care. Because if she cared, then she still saw him. But when she gave him only silence, he began to suspect that he might have walked out of her heart long before he ever opened his mouth. Some nights, he would scroll through her WhatsApp chats while she was in the bathroom, half hoping to find another man, something to justify the nagging discomfort in his belly. But there was nothing, just messages from schools, her sister, and a long, unfinished message to herself saved in drafts. One morning, he saw her take pictures of the kids in front of the house. "Is it for school project?" he asked. She nodded without looking up. Something like that. He smiled, not because he believed her, but because he didn't care enough to press further. He thought it was cute. He thought wrong. What Ibuka didn't know was that every little thing she did was part of something much bigger. Each picture she took, each phone call made in the corridor, each quiet moment with the children, those were bricks she was stacking for the bridge she would use to walk away. Her feet moved carefully, like a woman stepping over broken glass barefoot, steady and silent. The documents he carelessly left on the dining table were no longer invisible to her eyes. She read everything: property titles, account information, names of land agents. She wasn't looking for revenge, she was looking for release. Some days, she watched him from the kitchen window as he laughed with his friends in the compound, gesturing with large arms like a man who owned the earth and the air above it. And in those moments, she realized just how small he had become in her heart. A man who once stood tall like Irako in her soul had now shrunk to the size of his own shadow. She didn't hate him. Hate takes too much energy, and she was saving hers. Instead, she watched him the way people watch the final embers of a fire they once warmed their hands by. She no longer wanted to rebuild anything with him. She simply wanted to step away before the smoke claimed her lungs. Evenings were the hardest. That was when the children gathered around her, full of stories and chaos, while Ibuka either locked himself in the room or scrolled endlessly on his phone. She tried to shield them from the shift, but children are like cats. They sense what adults try to bury. One night, as she tucked Abena into bed, he whispered, "Mummy, will we still stay here when Daddy's new wife comes?" And Kim froze for a moment. Her throat felt like it had swallowed hot yam. She kissed his forehead and said, "We'll go somewhere better." But her heart cracked in places it had tried so hard to patch. That night, she lay on the mattress with eyes wide open, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional hoot of a distant Okada. Ibuka lay beside her, snoring with the confidence of a man convinced that silence meant surrender. She turned her back to him and whispered a date to herself. It was only a few weeks away now. The world didn't need to see her packing or crying or fighting. They would only see her absence, like a painting removed from a wall, leaving behind only the nail and the memory of color. She had made peace with the idea of being forgotten by the wrong man. What mattered now was being remembered by her children as the woman who left before life taught her how to beg. The morning Ibuka traveled was the kind of day that didn't give hints, neither from the clouds nor from the wind, that anything would change before sunset. He dragged his box to the front of the house with the ease of someone who had done it too many times before, dressed in his usual semi-formal wear, a checkered shirt, slightly faded jeans, and loafers polished just enough to fool the proud eye. Inkim handed him his face towel like always, her expression untroubled, as though it were just another Monday, not the final thread of a shared life. He stood for a while, watching her as she wiped Tabena's mouth by the gate. The toddler had spilled pap on his chin again, and Inkim didn't rush. She knelt and cleaned him gently, her back turned to Ibuka. "I'll be in Iguashi till Friday or so," he said loud enough for her to hear. "Work trip. Government audit team." She didn't look up. "Safe journey," she replied. That was all. No goodbye hug, no unnecessary drama, no questions about when he'd return. He gave a brief nod, waved at his older kids, and left. His footsteps sounded steady, unaware that every one of them pulled a pin from the bomb he'd built with his own pride. And Kim didn't wave. She wiped the last drop of pap from Tabena's chin, stood up slowly, and carried him inside. She locked the gate, closed the curtains, and exhaled as if she'd just stepped out of a room filled with smoke. She didn't move immediately. That first night without Ibuka in the house, she sat cross-legged on the sitting room rug long after the children had fallen asleep. A dim rechargeable lamp beside her cast a soft glow on the floor, and her eyes, wide open, looked past the walls, as though she was speaking to the quiet itself. She reached into a file bag and spread out papers, the house deed, photocopies of Ibuka's business documents, her children's birth certificates, and a worn blue diary that held her savings plans. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. Her hands moved slowly, flipping each page like a woman counting the final grains of time before a long harvest. The house was in both their names, but Ibuka had assumed it was only his. She had signed papers during construction with a silent hand, her name nestled beneath his on lines most men never bother to read. The Toyota Corolla was a joint gift from his brother who lived abroad. The land in Akbaro was in Ibuka's name, yes, but the car and house, those could move. And so, she made the calls. First to a quiet man named Odin, who sold high-end cars for cash, then to a property agent known for speed and silence. She said very little on the phone, but her tone was like a closed briefcase, businesslike, direct, final. By morning, she had a buyer for the car. By afternoon, a meeting was scheduled for the house inspection. She fed her children quietly, their questions about Daddy answered with soft he-went-for-work responses. But beneath her wrapper, Enkim's heart was armored in resolve. The days that followed were swift but subtle, like footsteps on polished tiles, there, yet leaving no sound. The Corolla disappeared from the driveway 2 mornings later, and the children asked if Mechanic Uncle came to take it. Enkim nodded, saying, yes, for repair. The buyer had paid in cash, and the money was tucked into small folds of an old school bag, now hidden in a rice sack under the bed. The house viewing happened while the children were at school, and Enkim, dressed in a modest blouse and long skirt, walked through each room with the prospective buyer, explaining what she could leave behind and what she intended to carry. The buyer was pleased. The agent said the cash would be ready in 4 days. She nodded calmly. She didn't want more time. She only needed just enough. With each step, Kim felt her body loosening from the chains she had worn like jewelry. The final piece of the puzzle was their line. Her SIM card was replaced. Her WhatsApp was moved to a new number. Her Instagram deleted. No posts, no stories, no breadcrumbs. She reached out to Chioma, her old classmate who now worked in passport processing. I'm not asking you for help, she said, her voice even. I'm paying for a service. No discounts. Just speed. Chioma agreed, no questions asked. That night, Kim packed their clothes into 2 old Ghana must-go bags and locked them in her wardrobe. The house still looked the same, but it was no longer a home. It was a waiting room, and the clock on the wall had begun to tick louder. The morning she left was soaked in sunlight, as if the sky was offering her its own kind of blessing. She wore a plain wrapper and t-shirt, strapped to Benna on her back, and held her daughters by the hand. A taxi waited just past the junction, engine running low, the driver chewing gum and tapping the steering wheel impatiently. The agent handling the house had received the signed documents the previous night. The keys were now with him. She took one final look at the compound, not for sentiment, but for clarity. This was the place where she had smiled while bleeding, cooked while aching, mothered through shadows, and served silence like sacrament. She opened the gate, led her children out, and locked it behind her with hands that didn't shake. They entered the cab, the bags stacked by their feet, and drove off without anyone waving goodbye. Enkim didn't look back once. In a short-let apartment in Otobo, she opened the bags, bathed her children, and fed them without rush. She spread one mattress on the floor, placed her Bible on a side stool, and lay down beside them. Her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She blocked it. Another call came through. She blocked that one too. She wasn't hiding. She was done. That night, as she watched her children sleep beside her, faces calm in a way they hadn't been in weeks, she whispered to herself, so this is what breathing feels like. There were no stars in the sky, but for the first time in years, she didn't need any to find her way. And Kim didn't celebrate her escape. She didn't post cryptic captions or update anyone about her departure. This wasn't the kind of win that called for noise or champagne. It was the kind of victory that came wrapped in stillness, like the sound of a locked gate behind you after walking away from a place that nearly swallowed your spirit. In the small, undecorated apartment in Otobo, her days now passed without eyes watching her every move. She woke up before the children, boiled water for their baths, cooked small meals in silence, and folded their clothes like prayers stacked into neat piles. She had only one rechargeable lamp, and at night it glowed like a low burning star beside their shared mattress. She didn't cry much anymore. She had done all her weeping in the old house, in bathrooms where tiles listened better than her husband ever did. Now her body was learning peace, the way the body learns to float after years of drowning, slowly and with disbelief. Every time she looked at her children playing in the corner, laughing without looking over their shoulders, she felt a stitch loosen inside her. It was a strange thing to mourn a man who was still alive, but stranger still to realize you didn't miss him at all. She didn't long for his voice, or his touch, or the way he used to laugh with his mouth wide open like he had never told a lie. All she missed, really, was the version of herself who had once believed he was incapable of breaking her. The day the property agent sent the cash from the house sale, and Kim stared at the thick envelope like it was a mirror reflecting all her bruises back at her in full color. It wasn't the money that moved her, it was the validation. Proof that she wasn't crazy all those years she felt trapped. It arrived in silence, brought by a bike man wearing dark glasses and a neutral face. "Madam, EB say now this flat number dim give me," he said, holding out the package with both hands. And Kim signed without speaking, tucked it into her handbag, and locked the door. That evening, she bought new clothes for the children, updated their school records with a different address, and paid off some unpaid school fees from the old term. Her steps were steady now. She no longer double-checked the locks with fear in her throat. She no longer jumped at the sound of her name. Instead, she began making inquiries about migration options, student visa, relocation pathways, anything that could give her children what Ibuka's ego never could: safety, stability, and a name that wasn't tied to shame. Chioma introduced her to a travel consultant named Barris, who asked no questions beyond "How soon can you start the process?" And Kim didn't tell anyone about it. Not her sister, not her old neighbor Chinya, not even the agent who sold the house. Secrets, she had learned, were safer when buried in action, not shared in whispers. And so she moved like smoke, invisible but everywhere, touching things quietly and leaving no trace. Ibuka returned from his trip to meet the walls of his life rearranged. The front gate didn't open with his key. The compound looked the same, but something was off, like furniture shifted just slightly in a room you once called yours. He knocked. Then he knocked again. Then he pounded. A neighbor peeked from the upstairs balcony and shouted, "Oga, dim don move o." Ibuka's laugh was short and confused, like a cough that didn't finish. "Move?" he repeated, his bag slipping slightly from his shoulder. "You mean my wife?" The neighbor shrugged, disappeared inside, and closed their curtain like someone who didn't want to get involved. He tried calling her. The line rang, then disconnected. He tried her WhatsApp. The profile picture was gone. He sat on the pavement near the fence, wiping sweat from his face, trying to remember if she had mentioned anything before he left. But all he could recall was her voice saying, "Safe journey." He walked to the agent who helped with the house documents 3 years ago and was met with a polite but cold reception. "Sir, I can't discuss a client's private business," the man said, not blinking. Ibuka's voice grew sharp. "She's my wife." The man's tone remained flat. "Then I suggest you speak to her directly." For the first time since that night in their bedroom, Ibuka felt the ground begin to shift beneath him. It wasn't just that she had left, it was that she had vanished in a way he hadn't prepared for. Pride had told him she was too small to move mountains. He had no idea she had become the earthquake. He didn't sleep for 2 nights, not because he was worried for her safety, but because he couldn't understand how she had outplayed him in a game he thought he created. He called her siblings, her friends, even her former boss. Nobody knew anything, or if they did, they weren't talking. The silence was louder now, mocking him. He returned to his friend Chuka's house and sat on the plastic chair in the front yard, staring into the air. "She asked you for 2 months, didn't she?" Chuka said after a long pause. Ibuka nodded slowly, his hand gripping the warm beer bottle in his lap. "Then maybe you should have asked why," Chuka muttered, not looking at him. His phone vibrated, another number he didn't recognize. He answered, but it was a wrong call. He leaned back, staring at the sunset like it could explain something. But the sky, like Nankim, had no interest in giving him closure. He opened the gallery on his phone and found an old video of his children laughing on Christmas morning, and him behind the camera saying, "Smile, Biko. Daddy's watching." He watched it 3 times. By the 4th, he was no longer smiling. The house was gone. The car was gone. And the woman he thought couldn't live without him had taken the only things that ever really mattered: his children and his peace. And all she ever said was, "Okay." The night stretched long for Ibuka, stitched together by insomnia and regret that arrived without knocking. He no longer returned to his old house, what was left of it, anyway. The shell of the home mocked him too much, standing empty yet echoing with memories that now sounded like betrayal. Instead, he rented a modest room behind his cousin's compound, the type of place that had only one light switch, a creaking fan, and a mattress that carried the scent of its previous tenants. Each evening, he sat by the small metal window, staring into a quiet street that offered no answers. The chair beneath him had 3 legs and wobbled like his pride, but he didn't care anymore. The once boastful man, who swaggered through life like he had a spare heart in his pocket, now moved like a paper floating through Harmattan winds, aimless, crumbling. Friends stopped checking in. Even his side flings stopped replying to texts, sensing something rotten had set in. The man who once thought he was the sun now realized no one missed him when he dimmed. He would scroll through old pictures of the children, pausing at each one, as if hoping they would blink. Their laughter, their scribbled birthday cards, the sound of them running through the corridor. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had misplaced a universe. And the most painful part was that she didn't need to raise her voice or slap him with drama. She simply packed the pieces of her soul and left him to face the mirror alone. Ibuka went to the police station one morning, dusty files tucked under his arm, and a look of rehearsed victimhood smeared across his face. He spoke with force, listing assets and dates, painting Inkim as a cunning wife who stole his children and disappeared with his property. The officer, a tired-looking man with sleepy eyes and a skeptical smile, listened without interrupting. When Ibuka finished, the officer leaned back, chewing silently on a toothpick, then said, "So you gave her 2 months, and she left after 2 weeks?" Ibuka blinked. "Yes, but she—" The officer raised a hand. "And the house? Whose name?" Ibuka shifted. "Joint," he muttered. "And the car?" "Also joint," he admitted, each word feeling like a feather dipped in acid. The officer sighed and pushed the file back toward him. "Oga, this one no be police case. This one na marriage walla way don expire." Ibuka clenched his jaw, frustrated by the indifference, but deep down, he knew the man was right. There was no case. No crime. Just consequence. He walked out of the station slower than he had entered, dragging his ego behind him like an overfed goat. He tried calling in Kim's siblings again. They no longer picked. Tried messaging her old colleagues. Blue ticks with no replies. It dawned on him in real time that he wasn't just blocked online. He was blocked in real life. Life itself had shut the door on him and thrown away the key. For the first time in years, he felt like an outsider to his own blood. He didn't need prison bars to feel imprisoned. His conscience had become his cell, and regret was the warden. Word of his situation began to circulate quietly, not loudly like rumors do in beer parlors, but softly, like the way a pot simmers before it spills. His cousin's wife no longer greeted him with warmth. The neighborhood women who once smiled at his presence now whispered behind his back while tying wrappers by their gates. One evening he overheard a child say, "Nah, that man way him wife run comet be that." And though the words came from small lips, they struck like hammer to nail. He sat indoors more, refusing visitors, eating less, even combing his hair with less care. He had always imagined himself as the center of every room, the man with plans and backup plans. But now, sitting alone with yesterday's clothes still on his body, he could no longer hide behind his title or charm. The new woman he had planned to marry, the so-called upgrade, never answered his calls again. Perhaps she too had heard the echo of his fall. Or perhaps she had simply seen what Kim had seen, a man who wore leadership like cologne, but lacked the backbone to love right. On one particularly quiet afternoon, he found a child's shoe beneath the bed. It was Tabina's, a worn, soft blue sandal with one strap missing. He held it like an artifact, not sure whether to smile or break. He remembered Tabina's giggle, the way he used to sneak into his father's room and climb the bed like a mountain made just for him. Now that room was gone, and so was the boy. That evening, Ibuka did something he hadn't done in a long time. He wept, not the performative sniffles of self-pity, but deep, wordless groans that bent his body into the kind of prayer no religion teaches. Elsewhere, miles away, Kim sat in an immigration office waiting room with her 3 children beside her, their travel documents in a blue plastic file pressed against her chest. The room was filled with quiet hums, blinking screens, and the soft murmur of hopes being processed. Her children, now used to their new life rhythms, sat calmly, no longer asking about their father, no longer clinging to silence like fear. And Kim had dressed them neatly that day, not extravagantly, but with care, a clean shirt for Tabina, matching sandals for the girls. As she looked around the waiting room, she saw other mothers too. Some nervous, some hopeful, all carrying fragments of lives they were trying to stitch into something whole. When her number was called, she stood up with steady grace, walking toward the officer's desk like a woman who had finally found her legs after crawling for too long. The officer reviewed the papers, asked a few questions, then nodded. "All set," he said. "Please await further instructions by email." Kim thanked him quietly and returned to her seat, her arms wrapped around the children like both shelter and shield. Outside the building, as they waited for their ride, she looked up at the sky. No clouds. Bempestak Rutamika no festive. Brought Babat accelerated. Mentos dortos aladas. Bottle tas school bummel. Model fosa. Soltam en efter pented of your middle. No kentabaus. No cletiro. No kiles. Darfuzo harofozo. Bandofo foso and merpularit and guatha. Mental level tapping na bezam reviewer. Battle to leven pera one hombre beta. Although below your kina tirepere bentab turota branded. Bommerote le sa partidemi. Dove tempere capa. Below le veves berentemi debegin. Just a wide, quiet blue. Her daughter leaned in and whispered, "Mummy, are we going to fly in the sky?" And Kim smiled. "Yes," she said. "Soon." And though the sky offered no promises, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She wasn't running anymore. She was arriving, slowly, firmly, and with every part of herself intact. The airport hall buzzed with a quiet kind of anticipation, the kind that made people check their passports 3 times and hold their children's hands a little tighter. And Kim stood in the middle of it all, a black backpack slung over one shoulder, her 3 children close like shadows that had learned to follow without question. Her youngest, Tabina, clung to her wrapper with one hand and held a biscuit in the other, his eyes scanning the ceiling as though he might find magic there. The 2 older girls stood with wide eyes and tightened mouths, their faces caught between curiosity and the remnants of fear they were slowly outgrowing. Enkim had done everything she could in silence, paid the fees, signed the forms, answered the long, prying questions from visa officers who asked as if they were gatekeepers of another life. But she never complained. Every line she stood in, every document she photocopied, every sleep she lost was part of a much bigger sentence she was determined to finish. Today was the final word. The boarding call came, not like thunder, but like a soft bell in a church of second chances. She looked at her children. "Are we ready?" she asked. The girls nodded. Benna clapped once and then hugged her leg. As they joined the queue, Enkim felt no triumph, no explosive joy. What she felt was cleaner, relief. Relief that she had walked through the fire barefoot and made it to the other side with no applause and no audience, just her and the children she refused to lose. They sat by the departure gate for nearly an hour before boarding, and during that time, Kim allowed herself one memory. Just one. She closed her eyes, leaned her head back, and saw it again. The night Ibuka turned to her and said he no longer loved her. It had been so quiet, yet so loud. A moment that stretched across her skin like fire under glass. She remembered the way his voice had no tremor, like a man ordering soup and not ending a decade. She remembered how her own voice had betrayed no anger. Just okay. That one word, she realized, had become her passport, not just to another country, but to herself. It was the beginning of her detachment, the seed of her rebellion, the softest battle cry a woman could give. And what followed was not noise or chaos, but a methodical, graceful undoing of everything she had once sown with tears. She had left no broken windows behind, no bitterness for her children to inherit. She had simply exited with the grace of a woman who had spent too long explaining her worth in rooms that spoke only the language of ego. When she opened her eyes again, the boarding line had started to move. She stood up and reached for their bags. The girls followed her, their steps light, their faces glowing in the reflection of the polished floors. Benna reached up for her hand. "Mummy, are we really flying now?" he whispered. She smiled, bent down to his level, and said, "Yes, my son. And we're not just flying, we're leaving the ground for good." Meanwhile, in a small flat back in Ugwashi, Ibuka sat on a plastic chair with the legs slightly uneven, watching the kettle boil as if the rising steam could offer him redemption. The room around him was small, plain, and unfurnished beyond what was necessary. The walls had lost their color, and so had his days. He had aged in a way that wasn't visible on his face, but was carved into the way he now sat, bent, unsure, like a man who had misplaced his script and arrived late to his own play. The phone beside him hadn't rung in hours. When it did, it was often a missed call from someone asking about a debt or a cousin reminding him that his rent was nearly due. He had stopped calling Enkim weeks ago, not because he didn't want to hear her voice, but because he had accepted that he never would. The realization had come to him slowly, the way fog lifts from a valley, not suddenly, but layer by reluctant layer. She hadn't blocked him out of bitterness. She had blocked him to breathe. And perhaps that hurt more, because it meant she wasn't trying to punish him. She had simply outgrown him. He stood up, walked to the kettle, and turned it off. Then he sat back down and stared at nothing in particular. It was evening again, and like every other evening since her departure, the room filled up with memories instead of people. And no matter how many windows he opened, they refused to leave. One night, weeks later, a letter arrived, not a call, not a message, just a plain envelope slid under his door by a dispatch rider who didn't wait. Inside it was a drawing, crayon on white paper, folded neatly in half. A sun, a house, a tree, and 4 stick figures. One tall woman. 3 children. Beneath it, in crooked handwriting, were the words from Benna, for Daddy. No return address, no message from Tim. Just the art of a child who had not yet learned that forgiveness and forgetting were not the same thing. Ibuka held the paper like it might catch fire if he breathed too hard. He stared at it for so long that the day became night, without him noticing. He finally placed it on his small table, beside the only family photo he had left, the one where Kim was holding the baby, and he was mid-laugh, looking at her like she held the center of the world. That photo had faded now, much like the version of himself he thought could never be abandoned. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence swallow him whole. Outside, the wind blew softly through the trees, but inside there was no movement. Just stillness. No tears. No anger. No anger. Just a man and a drawing, and the echo of a word that once sounded so simple. Okay. Sometimes silence is not weakness. It is strategy. It is survival. It is a woman preserving the last piece of herself when everything else has been stripped bare. Kim didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam doors or call a meeting of elders. She simply listened, packed her piece, and left. And in doing so, she rewrote her story without asking for permission. To everyone listening, whether you are male or female, never wait for your world to catch fire before you reach for the extinguisher. Learn to read the weather in your own house. If someone you love suddenly stops speaking, don't assume it's surrender. It may be the silence of someone counting steps toward the door. And if you're the one walking through hard seasons, remember, you don't owe anyone noise for your healing to be valid. Let your dignity speak louder than your pain. Don't underestimate the strength of someone who says okay and moves on. That kind of silence is made of steel. And to the men who believe they can hold love hostage while they explore their options, remember that love is not a chain. It's a gift. And once withdrawn, no apology or possession can replace it. Choose peace over performance. Choose freedom over appearances. And when the time comes to walk away, may you do so with your head high, your heart whole, and your story still yours to tell. Heavenly Father, to everyone who feels unseen, unheard, or underestimated, let this be their season of rising without noise. May they find the courage to move forward, even if their legs tremble and their heart carries the weight of 1,000 goodbyes. May their pain not swallow them, but shape them into something stronger, wiser, and more beautiful. For every listener who has been told they are not enough, Lord, remind them that they were always more than someone else's opinion. For every heart that has been broken in silence, rebuild it with grace. For every woman standing alone with children in her arms and tears behind her smile, let favor find her in unexpected places. Let open doors replace closed hearts. We pray for the men, too, those learning too late what they once took for granted. Teach them that love is not ownership, that ego is not leadership, and that sometimes the real lesson comes after the crowd has gone, and all they have left is the echo of what they dismissed. Lord, bless every listener with wisdom that doesn't need to shout, with strength that doesn't need applause, with peace that passes all understanding. And when they finally find the courage to rewrite their story, let every page be soaked in purpose, not pity. Let no one under the sound of this story be stuck in places where their worth is overlooked. May healing locate them. May restoration visit them. And may joy find them, even if it has to knock on a back door. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.